é bando quem quer.
Folks, if we could take our seats again, please. The panel is here and ready to go. Shh. There we go. Ladies and gentlemen, to run our first panel of the day, the President and CEO of the Council of the Americas, Susan Siegel. Susan, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Eric, and I again want to thank Eric and his team for putting together this amazing conference, so thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, we are all in for a very important treat this morning as we discuss ways to strengthen the business case for the Americas, something that is near and dear to my heart, and I think to the hearts of everyone sitting on this stage today. Eric's already introduced me, so I will go right to the panel. Too often in global boardrooms today, the region is overlooked, or in boardrooms, sadly, very often board members decide to just pass on Latin America due to past experience. But today, from natural resources to infrastructure to critical minerals to innovative sectors, opportunities in the region are abundant. And the recent pandemic showed all of us that over-reliance on other regions is simply not a winning strategy. Now, how can we actually change the direction? How can we get Latin America back to the center of the thought process in boardrooms with the private sector? How can we center the Western Hemisphere in the global supply chains, seeking broad-based development through private sector-led growth, using tools that the United States already has or could design? Yesterday, the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, talked about resilient supply chains coming into the hemisphere, in manufacturing, in infrastructure, in digital infrastructure, and this is so critical to the future of the United States and to the entire hemisphere. So we have a remarkable panel to discuss this. Their bios are in your conference packets, and for those watching on live stream, all speakers' bios are on the Council of the Americas website. Now, to my right, Chris Dodd is the President's Special Advisor for the Americas. Rebecca Lisner, in blue, is the Deputy National Security Advisor to the Vice President. Jose Manuel Salazar is the head of ECLAC, the UN, seated next to Chris Dodd, the UN Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, and Arun Venkataraman, did I say that right? Spectacular, is the Assistant Secretary of Commerce and head of the U.S. and Foreign Commercial Service. So Chris, why don't I start with you?
Yep.
You're a champion for the Americas Partnership for Economic Prosperity Initiative, PEP, launched by the President at Los Angeles Summit of the Americas. Can you tell us a little bit more about it and how's it progressing?
Well, first of all, thanks for the invitation to come, and delighted to be back at the OAS and see such a tremendous turnout from the Council. So thank you for including me in all of this. And with the time we have, the biggest champion of this is the President of the United States. He gave two major speeches in Los Angeles, one on immigration and one on America's partnership for economic prosperity. So I'm delighted to have been asked by my former colleague in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. I was a Peace Corps volunteer when Thomas Jefferson was President of the United States.
Oh my goodness.
And so I've had a strong interest in the Americas.
Did you like him, Chris? Thomas Jefferson?
He was a wonderful person, yeah. Had his issues, but he was a fine guy. Cared a lot about Latin America, by the way. Anyway, so the involvement was a nice invitation to become part of his efforts. And you're right. In fact, I was at the first summit in Miami that President Clinton hosted many years ago and have participated over the years. This idea, the operative words are partnership. We've had obviously the good neighbor policy, the Alianza progressos in President Kennedy's term. But this is different, the word partnership and the word with, because it's really critical if this is going to work. What's been missing, despite all of the chatter we have in talks about the various problems, and you go down that long list of matters that are on the table of dealing with, none of them, not a single one of them, has much of a chance of surviving or being solved if we don't deal with the economic issues. That's the essential ingredient. I was pleased yesterday that that Mr. Sullivan started his remarks on APEP and realizing that if we don't have economic growth and job creation in the region, then everything from immigration, climate change, get down the long list. None of them are we going to solve, in my view, at all. So it's the essential ingredient, and it has to be a partnership, and not just linguistically a partnership, a real partnership. So the effort has gotten underway rather remarkably in many ways. 12 countries initially have joined this effort, all of whom have had free trade agreements or have policies and projects underway where investment or encouraging investment of the private sector there. You can't be for job creation and against the private sector. It just doesn't make any sense whatsoever. So the efforts, I spent last weekend in Los Angeles at the Milken Institute, where again, the subject again, and Latin America was a major player. Ilan Goldfein was there. My former Senate colleague, Bill Cassidy, was there. We'll talk about his proposal in a minute, America's Act, which has been introduced now in a bicameral, bipartisan way. I mean, you can't get bipartisanship in the Congress today on a Mother's Day resolution, let alone on Latin America. So we're showing some real progress, and we'll talk about that. But the whole idea is to develop and grow regional economic integration.
Yes.
In Latin America, it isn't enough that you give one country a free trade agreement. There are 20 of them around the world, free trade agreements. 12 of them are in the Americas. It's not been neglected as an area of free trade agreements, but they haven't grown into regional agreements. Mercosur was an effort, but really has never matured as much as everyone hoped it would. So until we can convince countries in the region that it's in their common interest to work together on these issues here, working with us and with others. I probably get in trouble suggesting this, but we need to be encouraging European involvement in the region, Asian involvement in the region from democratic countries as well. And there's a growing appetite to be involved as well. So I'm optimistic about this. As I mentioned, 12 countries have already indicated they want to be a part of this. They came to Washington. We had in November 3rd a meeting of 12 heads of state for almost 3 days at the IDB, where they all made presentations about their individual countries and what they offered to the private sector. The Senate Foreign Relations Committee hosted the 12 heads of state. Secretary of the Treasury met with them and has now initiated a meeting with the 12 foreign ministers of these APEP countries every year as the IMF and the World Bank gather here in Washington. We had the Secretary of the Treasury hosted a wonderful meeting with all 12 heads of state. And then the President of the United States invited them to meet in the East Room of the White House. Now, for those in this room, you'll appreciate that maybe more than others. There are a lot of ways and places you can have meetings in Washington, certainly at the State Department, at the Executive Office building, and so forth. To use the East Room of the White House as the venue to invite these 12 heads of state from the Americas was a lot more significant than I think most people realize here. It was elevating this meeting, and it came within a month, less than a month, after the tragedies in Gaza, in a sense. And candidly, and many of us understand this, excuse my voice, by the way, in the morning here, but in former administrations, and I say with great respect, had they been confronted with the problems in Gaza and the Ukraine, and we had scheduled this meeting for 11 or 12 heads of state, they would have said probably, why don't we wait until next year to do it? But the President of the United States didn't. He said, no, we're having the meeting in the White House to talk about these issues. And as a result, he elevated immediately the importance of this effort. So it's underway with agreements that are occurring. And I'll lastly say this to you, Susan. He said it well. He said it many years ago, but he repeats it all the time. And he's absolutely right. The Americas, from the Yukon to Ushuaia, represent 1/10 of the world's population. 60% of the lithium in the world is located in our hemisphere. We have 10 elections this year in the Americas. Had one in Panama on Sunday. You got elections in Mexico and others are coming up. We're the second most democratic part of the world outside of Western Europe. And so there's a lot to recommend. This Americas, our Americas. And we don't do that enough to celebrate the existing resources, human and natural, that exist in the region. So I'm very excited about this. We have 8 countries now that have indicated they would like to be a part of APEP. You've got the act in Congress, which we can talk about. These other resources that are knowledgeable people and see the value in them, the nearshoring, the supply chains, all of that is happening already. So we ought to be very optimistic about this. I'm reaching that point, as I say, having served with Thomas Jefferson, I'm reaching a point, but I'm excited about the appetite now in Congress, among the House of Representatives and the Senate and an administration that can work together on this. Sorry about the length of my answer.
No, that's okay. I'm also...
I'm an optimist.
I'm a total optimist.
Yeah.
I've worked with Latin America my whole life. So if I could now ask Jose Manuel, why don't you give us a little bit in 3 minutes about how you see the economic situation in Latin America right now?
Yes, well, thank you very much. First of all, it's an enormous pleasure and an honor to be in this distinguished panel. I was here at the OAS for 7 years, working on the free trade area of the Americas. You remember, everyone, the free trade area of the Americas, which at the moment was an enormous framework and proposal from the US to Latin America. I'll refer to that a little bit more. Look, we see from ECLAC Latin America and the Caribbean, which is enormous opportunities, but also going through not very good spots. In the last 10 years, the average growth of the region was only 0.8%. This is less than half the 2% at which the region grew in the famous lost decade of the 80s. So it's not good. It's very difficult to reduce poverty, to reduce informality, to create good jobs, etc., with the low rate of growth. Not growth per se. We know that growth has to be inclusive, has to create good jobs, has to be sustainable, and now there's all the green agenda in which countries are working very, very strongly. But this is why we're putting a lot of emphasis on what we're calling the great productive transformation that Latin American, Caribbean countries need to do. And there is a very well-known group of tools that you can use to really increase growth, to make it more inclusive, to make it more sustainable. We have a proposal where we have pointed out a list of at least 14 to 15 dynamizing sectors in which countries are actually working, most of them. That include, the great green push, everything that has to do with energy transition, with circular economy, with electrical mobility, with sustainable tourism, with food security, et cetera, is enormous. Then, of course, the whole agenda about services, particularly modern services, exported, ICT-enabled services. And there are many US companies already in Latin America. My own country, Costa Rica, our main exports is modern services enabled by internet. I mean, there are companies like Hewlett-Packard have 10,000 employees just doing that. It's much more than the initial phases of call centers. You have back office services. You have very sophisticated things one cannot even imagine in the exports of services. Uruguay is also developing quite a lot in that sense. So that's an enormous area of opportunity where there are many US companies already present. Then, of course, there are medical devices. Again, Costa Rica, Dominican Republic have major clusters in medical devices, most of them by American multinationals. So I think, the business scene is very vibrant, is very strong.
How's the economic scene? I mean, how do you see growth in Latin America?
Well, that is the thing, that all this new partnership of the United States with Latin American countries goes to the heart of one of the weaknesses of the traps in which Latin America is caught, which is this low growth trap. Yes. Now, I can give you figures, in terms we expect this year, and the IMF just published the World Economic, kind of revised for the world growth rates, and it predicts or expects 2% growth in Latin America on average. Okay, it's better than other years, but it's not brilliant. We expect 2.1. That's, of course, an average. There are differences. By the way, in those differences between South America and so on, Mexico and Central America grow much higher than South America. Why? Because the ties with the United States, precisely, which shows that the business case is win-win. The more you have with a dynamic economy like the United States. South America is more, for some countries, China is the first market of destination, or Europe. And of course, a lot of it is minerals and copper and so on, so it depends more on that. Of course, a lot of agriculture as well. So, I mean, perhaps in summary, there are many social challenges in Latin America. Our estimate is that the poverty rate is 29% at the moment. We're talking about 180 million people under the poverty line. Extreme poverty is 13%. So there is a lot that needs to be done. And the thing is that the economics is linked with the politics, because we see an erosion on democracies. There is a concern about democracy. There's a deterioration. There is an increase, which is a big challenge of organized crime, as you know, which is becoming, a big structural obstacle for growth itself. And not that we want to be deterministic, but you really have to have, democracies have to deliver. They have to deliver growth, they have to deliver good jobs, they have to deliver hope for people. And this is why this agenda about, economic growth and partnership, and just finish with this. If the great proposal of the United States in the 90s, in which I personally worked quite a lot, which is the free trade area of Americas, what was excellent. It didn't come to happen, at least as planned. But frankly, most countries, almost all countries in Latin America now have free trade agreements with the United States. So in a way, we got to the FTAA via complicated routes, but you have the framework that the FTAA was trying to create, a framework of basically free trade, a framework of security for investment, and many other chapters of trade agreement. So I think in this new phase, and with the geopolitical situations and the technological rivalry with China, and this and that, and microprocessors and the green transition and electrical mobility, I think the new phase of partnership between the United States and Latin America, win-win for both, is microeconomics, is do partnerships in specific sectors, like the ones I just mentioned. And I think that's the great contribution that the new approach, that you were mentioning can make. Latin American countries are investing and putting incentives and attracting investment in this. But there is huge opportunities, and there is an alignment, I think, between the new vision of industrial policies of the United States that is putting, efforts and incentives, and a lot of this can happen with Latin America, like it's happening with Mexico in many value chains.
Thank you very much. So, Rebecca, this Vice President addressed the 51st Washington Conference on the Americas in 2021, and she talked about Central America, and that has really been a key part, or will be a key part of her legacy when she launched a call to action. Can you tell us about the progress with Central America, and where do you see, where's further attention required?
Thanks so much, Susan. Thank you to the Council of the Americas. It's great to be here with my close colleague Arun, with Senator Dodd, with Jose. Thank you so much. So President Biden was very clear in his national security strategy that there is no region of the world that more directly affects the United States and the American people than the Western Hemisphere. And that's why, as I think you heard from Jake yesterday and Ambassador Thomas-Greenfield as well, we are moving out on an expansive and ambitious agenda throughout the hemisphere, whether that's the LA Declaration, whether that's the Americas Partnership that Senator Dodd just spoke to, ambitious work on climate, health, et cetera. And for that reason, the Vice President has spent a considerable amount of time on this hemisphere, and to just start off with her work on Central America, as you asked, Susan. So early in the administration, President Biden asked the Vice President to lead the development of a strategy to address the root causes of migration from Northern and Central America. And I think for President Biden, this is something of a vice presidential portfolio, because of course it is one that he also had when he was Vice President. And the Vice President took on a leadership role with alacrity in moving forward her first foreign trip outside of the United States. And remember, these were COVID times when it was very difficult to travel. In June of 2021 was to Guatemala and Mexico. And then in July of 2021, she launched what we call the root causes strategy. The root causes strategy is really rooted in her belief that fundamentally people do not want to leave their homes, they don't want to leave their communities, they don't want to leave their families. But what we need to do is create more hope for people where they live so that they don't have an incentive and an impetus to migrate. And so the root causes strategy covers a wide range of issues. It covers the importance of economic development. It covers the importance of anti-corruption and good governance, violence reduction, reduction of gender-based violence, and of course, human rights and labor rights as well. So ever since the release of the strategy in January of 2021, we have been aggressively implementing. We are on track to meet the President's and Vice President's commitment to spend $4 billion of US government money over 4 years in Central America, which is a major achievement. And while this is a long-term development effort, and we know that addressing the root causes of migration is not something that you can just do over the course of a couple of years, we are exceptionally proud of the results that we've already seen. More than 63,000 farmers have been able to increase their agricultural production as a result of our work under the root causes strategy. Millions of students have gained access to primary and secondary education. We have trained more than 35,000 police officers and others who work in the judicial sector, and thousands of human rights and labor rights activists have also received training and assistance from the US government as part of the root causes strategy. And of course, we're continuing to implement and working alongside many partners in the region in order to do so. But to the topic of this panel, I think from Vice President Harris's perspective, you cannot possibly have an effective strategy that addresses the root causes of migration if you don't bring in the private sector, because we all know how important private sector investment is to sustainable growth in any country, but especially in Northern Central America. And so that's why in May of 2021, the Vice President issued a call to action, as Susan mentioned, to call on the private sector to invest in Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. And this began as a somewhat modest effort. I don't think any of us knew exactly what it would amount to, but we are tremendously proud that in March of this year, Vice President Harris announced that this public-private partnership has now mobilized more than $5.2 billion of private sector and philanthropic investment in those 3 countries in Northern Central America. We now have more than 50 partners that span a wide range of sectors, from financial services to textile and apparel to technology, financial services, and so on. And we've seen, again, really tremendous results. So just from the investments through what we now call Central America Forward, which is the formalized umbrella public-private partnership that the US government has entered into with our outside 501c3 partner, the Partnership for Central America, we've now seen more than 4.5 million people who've been connected to the internet, more than 2.5 million people who've been brought into the formal financial economy. We believe that these investments have created more than 70,000 jobs. And these are really significant when you think about both the size of the economies that we're focused on, but also just the individual people. And as a matter of public-private partnership, the Vice President believes really strongly that it's critical that we bring the reach and the expertise of the private sector together with the capacity of the US government. And so that is what Central America Forward has done. We hear consistently from our outside partners that this is the most effective public-private partnership that they've ever been a part of. And that's because we've been able to bring together all these different sectors to concentrate their effort and create what the Vice President likes to call ecosystems of opportunity, which means that bringing all of our partners together, we're able to, for example, train workers, but also give them access to bank accounts and give them access to credit. And so you end up creating a whole ecosystem that allows people to move forward. The last thing that I would just say is that it's been critically important to the Vice President that all of this private sector investment be closely tethered to the goals of the root causes strategy. And so that's why we're working on initiatives that align private sector investment with the imperatives of sustainable and equitable growth. So, for example, the Vice President launched at the Summit of the Americas the In Her Hands initiative, which is focused on women's economic empowerment, because the Vice President believes that when you lift up the status of women, you lift up the status of their communities, their families, everyone benefits. So now $113 million has gone towards skills training and other job development opportunities specifically for women in Northern Central America. Additionally, last year she launched the Good Governance, Good Jobs Pledge, which is an effort to get the corporations who are part of this partnership to commit to transparency and anti-corruption practices that are rigorous and critically important, as we all know. And finally, the Central America Service Corps, which is a new initiative that gives vulnerable youth in Northern Central America access to community service opportunities, volunteer opportunities in high out-migration areas. and also attaches them to mentorship, job training, and so on, so that when they come off of those community service opportunities, they have a path forward in terms of economic opportunity. So we're really excited about this work. The Vice President is incredibly invested in this work. She was excited to sit with President Arevalo and a bunch of business leaders back in March to talk about next steps. And for anyone in the room that would like to get involved, there's also ample opportunity for additional partners to join.
Thank you very much for that passionate appraisal. Arun, we started talking about this last night, but we've all talked about now initiatives. Can you give us what's the strategic importance for Latin America and the Caribbean for the United States in terms of trade and investment? Talk a little bit about that, please.
Sure. Thanks, Susan, and thanks to the Council of Americas. Just for future reference, please don't put me at the end after three such distinguished speakers. So just got to get that out there.
I got it.
Look, it's funny to have to talk about the strategic importance of the Latin American Caribbean region here, because in many ways it's self-evident, right? This is our neighborhood, right? Proximity matters, and I think as Rebecca pointed out, and as the Senator pointed out, everything that happens in the region affects the United States, and of course everything that happens in the United States affects the region. We are bound together already. And so to speak of the strategic importance here is to acknowledge what is to us, I think, just an obvious imperative. And so when we think about the economic success and economic development of Latin America and the Caribbean, we see that success as a success for the United States because it is very much our neighborhood. And I think the data points bear this out. As the Senator pointed out, this region is home to 12 of our 20 free trade agreements. That is not by accident. You know, we talked about the historic initiative on the free trade area of the Americas. Again, that is not by accident. With these FTAs as the solid foundation, but not the exclusive foundation for our commercial and trading relationships in the region, we now, for the United States, trade more with the Americas than anywhere else in the world, to the tune of about $2 trillion in 2023. This region is specifically the destination for 43% of US exports of goods and services. And from where I sit, where I run an organization that exists to help small businesses export, this region is also often the starting point for those small businesses. They look right nearby to see what are those markets that I should be accessing, what are those customers that I should be reaching right here in our neighborhood. It also should be noted that on the flip side, the United States is the top trading partner for over 2/3 of the region's countries. And of course, is the region's largest source of foreign direct investment, in many cases for over 100 years. I think sometimes what gets lost in the news is, you know, when we have so many of our companies that have just been in the region and active and contributing to economic growth in the region for decades, and as I said, in some cases over 100 years, it's almost like, it's just become part of the routine, but it actually is incredible, and we are so incredibly proud of our American companies that are partnering in the region. And I think what they're doing today, and I think the critical nature of that partnership today is more than ever, our American companies are the ones that are capable of providing the very solutions to the policy objectives that leaders across the regions are trying to achieve. Whatever country you're talking about, we've had a number of elections, the Senator pointed out we have more elections coming up this year. Wherever you have leaders that have articulated objectives, in so many cases, American companies have the best solutions to help leaders meet those objectives. And we are very proud in the Commerce Department to not just stand up for American business, but to make sure that those partnerships materialize. Because at the end of the day, while it's important to have strategic partnerships, it's important to have high-level leader statements, we all know that it's the commercial partnerships that really build that connective tissue that underpin the strategic relationship. And again, because this is our neighborhood, we have been in all of these countries for so many years. And so when we talk about the strategic importance on the economic side, we cannot succeed unless Latin America and the Caribbean succeed. And our companies are a key part of that.
Yeah.
I completely agree with you, and I think everybody on this panel agrees with you. So we have 10 minutes and 42 seconds left. And so I'm going to ask each of you to be super brief, but I would like, Chris, you referred often to the Americas Act. Could you kind of talk to us? How does that fit in with APEP? And where does it stand?
Well, first of all, it codifies what APEP does, which is very encouraging. There was a recent article by Shannon O'Neill in Foreign Affairs in which he talks about this very idea of what we've done with APIC in the past. As we sit here today, APEC, I think in Singapore, has an office where 50 employees are working every day, all day, on trying to figure out how to grow economic opportunities for U.S. businesses in the Pacific region, in a sense, including, by the way, countries like Chile, like Peru, like Mexico, that are part of the Pacific Rim deals. I think that's a tremendous idea. I didn't know Senator Cassidy before. I've known Michael Bennet for a long, long time. I know Adriana Espaillat in the House of Representatives. I don't know Congresswoman Salazar. But in this day and age, without getting into any excruciating details, we've all witnessed the lack of bipartisanship in the Congress of the United States. It was sort of a hallmark in the years that I served in the institutions up there. Here's an example of exactly what we've been missing here. You don't have to agree with every dotted I and crossed T. But what Bill Cassidy and Michael Bennet have done, and with their House counterparts, is offer some ideas on how we encourage private sector investment. You get the Congress of the United States now, the Article I division of our government, suggesting exactly what we're talking about today. And then secondly, you have an administration that is as committed to this through its APEP proposals. This is a rarity. I know it doesn't seem like such for many people, but believe me, for someone who's been around this town for a long time, this is exciting to me, that we have these similarities between the Congress of the United States and the executive branch. So I'm very optimistic about it. Senator Cassidy and I spent a good part of last weekend talking about this exactly and talking about the welcoming of these ideas. The administration welcomes, it doesn't yet endorse, but administrations rarely endorse anything until there's a final product that comes to their desk. But I can tell you flatly that they do welcome this idea that has come from the Senate and the House. So I think it's very exciting. We rarely get, the administration wants one thing, the Congress wants something else. And here there are differences. I'm not suggesting there are not. But the essence of it, the center of it, is how do we encourage more economic development? Let me take advantage of one point I want to say, and to Jose, to you. I don't believe it's just Central America. I think they have a heightened degree of interest. In Costa Rica, obviously, with Intel there, 4,000 Costa Ricans working at it. There are 34 countries in our hemisphere, including the United States and Canada. My experience has been that almost every country would prefer to be doing business with the United States, with Western Europe, with democracies in the Asian Pacific region here. What they have had to do in too many cases is turn to the Chinese bank, basically, what do I call debt diplomacy. I'll lend you money, I'll build the project, and if you don't pay me back, I own the project. It's not a complicated formula, in a sense, but that's what it is. And other countries, again, I'm not speaking absolutely every single one, but the vast majority would much prefer to be doing business with the West. What's missing, and why the free trade agreements didn't end up doing what I think many of us intended for it to do, and that is to grow regional economic integration. This is a problem in the Western Hemisphere, and we've got to break that down, in a sense. You can't solve these problems one country at a time. You can do something to help along the way, but until there's that understanding that on climate change, on immigration, on new energy technologies and so forth, you got to share in this thing. This is a difficult problem, frankly, I say candidly, to those in the room who come from the region. There needs to be more cooperation and integration economically, or all these ideas will have a marginal impact and effect. So I emphasize that particular point.
I think that is the critical point, because, and it's also the critical point to enhance security in the region, is a regional approach to this, where the U.S. can help and provide technology.
Well, as President Biden says over and over, and has said it for more than a decade, it wasn't just a day ago, he believes that our hemisphere could be the most prosperous, the most democratic, and the most secure.
Absolutely.
That's the aspiration. we all ought to have. And I think it's within our reach to do so.
I agree. So Arun, I'm not going to wait till last for you. I'm going right to you. Yeah. So how can we promote greater U.S. and market-led private sector engagement? Because all of this, countries want us to invest, but somehow we're not mobilizing enough funds quickly enough to make the strategic investments. So how can we do this?
So I think there's a couple of ways that we can think about. The first is assert our competence and our strength and highlight our comparative advantage. And I talked about the fact that American companies are the solutions for many of the objectives the leaders in the region want to achieve. And we can look at those specific sectors. I mean, take climate technologies or clean energy, for example, where across the region, we know leaders are anxious to take actions to build resilience, to combat climate change, and to move in this energy transition to a cleaner energy mix. All of that is going to involve U.S. technologies. There is no way the region, or frankly the world, is going to achieve its climate ambitions without U.S. technologies. And so how can we bring U.S. technologies to the region? And that's part of what we're doing through our trade missions, through our trade shows, to highlight the availability of technologies and highlight their superiority in so many ways. What we also need to do, though, is as we talk about those technologies and as we know that we have these solutions, we still have to fight the good fight and outcompete. We have strong competitors in the region, and not all of them share the same values. So we have to do what we can to make sure that we are at the table and outcompeting them. And so what that means that we have to do is we have to continue to work with governments in the region as they take steps to maintain a level playing field and to introduce more transparent processes that are easier for business to succeed in those environments. We also are working very hard with governments to find out about commercial opportunities at the earliest instances, find out where those infrastructure projects are that American companies should be competing for, and make sure that our companies here find out about them as soon as possible so they can get in on the ground floor and bid for those projects. And then, of course, we also have to make sure that as we do that, we don't just inform our American companies of the opportunities, we work with them to make them aware of all of the available resources across the federal, state, and local governments to support their exports and their economic activity in the region. And that includes making sure the financing options are available, the de-risking programs that we have, whether it's through DFC or EXIM, as we've seen across the region, whether those programs are available, and how can we make them available in a timely manner. And I think that's one of the things we're continuing to work on is how to move government at the speed of business.
That is a really important point. So, Jose Manuel, in a minute, because we only have 2 minutes and 52 seconds left, tell us if we had 10% or 20% more investment in Latin America, how much more growth would that actually generate, in your opinion?
Oh, well, that's a very specific question. It would be
in general.
Yeah, no, it certainly be very, very good news. Actually, foreign direct investment flows peaked in Latin America in 2022, $45 billion of foreign direct investment. This is the figure we had in our latest, flagship on foreign direct investment. Most of it is U.S. investment. Of course, a lot of it, most in terms of countries of destinations, is Mexico and Brazil. So I think, all the, and my country and Dominican Republic, and there are many examples of countries that can be transformed tremendously by these flows, by having a cluster of medical devices, having all these clusters of modern services. I think there's one sector where there's enormous opportunities that the U.S., and probably this is very much along the lines of what you were saying, the government and some, the Department of Commerce have to work with the private sector in the United States, where I think there's a lot of opportunities that U.S. companies are not really taking advantage of, which is the whole building of infrastructure.
Right.
It's enormous. Latin America is building and will need to build all sorts of things, roads, dams, all the new, all sorts of new kinds of infrastructure, not to talk about the connectivity and digital infrastructure for everything and so on. So on all those areas, I think there's enormous untapped potential. Tourism is going to grow a lot, but I know the hotels and airlines of the U.S. are very well positioned. So I think, again, to say, look, and just to connect with what you said, I think one of the major root causes of migration to the United States is this low rate of growth of Latin America, 0.8. I mean, we're not creating enough jobs. The rate of job creation was 1% last year. I mean, it used to be 5, 6%. So, I mean, no wonder people want to, I mean, they have no jobs, not to talk about all the other causes. It's not the only cause. But anything in terms of the partnership that the U.S. can do, so that that rate of growth of Latin America hopefully is 3 or 4%, can make a huge difference in transforming this #1 root cause for migration.
Thank you. So, Senator Dodd wants to make a comment, and then I'm going to give Rebecca the last word.
No, just subject. One thing that we've got to debunk is the notion that what we're talking about here is going to cost jobs in the United States and elsewhere. It is absolutely false. These ideas are job creators at home. And that needs to be part of the equation, because I can tell you what the campaigns will sound like when you start talking about ideas like this. Well, we're going to drain jobs out of the United States. Exactly what Jose just mentioned here. It does quite the opposite. Exactly. And if you don't believe, talk to Bill Cassidy about this, and the Republican senator from Louisiana. It's a job creator. And secondly, U.S. companies have to bid. You know, it's one thing to claim we don't get the jobs, but if you don't bid on the projects, on infrastructure particularly, of course you don't get the jobs. So we need to be more aggressive about trying to win over these contracts along the way. So those two things are terribly important.
That's critical, and financing the contracts, and if we get more work overseas, it creates more jobs in this country.
Home, yeah.
So, Rebecca, the Vice President, I'm always asking the woman question last, but the Vice President's been a champion for democracy, including women's rights, and extending women's opportunities for women. Where can we work together to make a difference there? Because I think that is so critical. It touches everything we've discussed today, and it also touches migration. If women are well employed and protected in their home countries, they have no desire to move. So could you comment a little bit about that?
Sure, absolutely. Well, as I said before, for the Vice President, and this applies, of course, in this region, but in any region of the world, she believes really strongly that it's imperative that we invest in the status of women, because the status of women is a barometer for the status of any democracy. And when you invest in women, research always shows, the benefits to communities and families are exponential. And so that's why throughout her work in the region, the Vice President has prioritized women's economic empowerment, whether that's the In Her Hands initiative, which I mentioned a moment ago, creating jobs, skills training for women, whether that's the pillar of the root causes strategy that aims to address gender-based violence, which we know is a particularly acute problem in some of the countries in Northern Central America. And it also applies to the Vice President's personal engagement. When she visited the region, she met with indigenous women activists, among others. She's always making sure that the voices of the most marginalized, often women, but not exclusively women, are taken seriously. And I'll say that when President Arevalo came to the White House back in March, they had a really extensive conversation about the importance of lifting up the indigenous community in Guatemala, which of course is a critical part of his platform and his agenda in Guatemala. It's something that is important to her as well, both in the United States and overseas. And the Partnership for Central America and through Central America Forward, business leaders have also committed to focusing investment and focusing our public-private partnership work in areas where there are high rates of indigenous populations, to ensure that the benefits of the sustainable, equitable growth also reaches those parts of the country as well. So across the board, the women's economic empowerment piece of this equation is incredibly, incredibly important and really fundamental to all of the work that we're doing.
So I want to thank all four of you. I'm going to ask one more question really quickly. Do you think we promote what we do in the hemisphere well enough, bundling everything we do? It's just a yes or a no.
No.
There's room for improvement.
Agree, there's room for improvement.
Oh, no.
Okay, so that tells us, tells it all. So we are doing so much. I think there's a lot of consensus about the opportunity, the magnitude of the opportunity, but I think we have so much more to do to make this a reality. But I think also the essence of this is, how do we bundle everything we're doing so it appears not in silos, but as one big project?
Let me just say, what Bill Cassidy and his colleagues are trying to do, what President Biden has initiated 2 years ago in Los Angeles is different. It's basically saying we can do sanctions every day. We don't like some country, what they're doing, we impose sanctions. Easiest thing to impose, most difficult to lift, ultimately. This is a different approach. This is saying, join us in this democratic, prosperous approach, security approach on job creation in countries. People don't leave their nations of birth and language and culture unless it's an act of desperation. This country in the United States understands that better than any other country in the world, in my view. And yet, too often we reject the idea of this as a critical element in keeping people home. But secondly, offering the alternative, showing what countries can do when we work together to impose and strengthen democracy, prosperity, and opportunity. You can make a huge difference. But we need to do that differently than we've been doing. It is a different approach, but one that I think brings about the likelihood of success in the areas we've talked about.
I think you're 100% right. Yeah. And I think all I'm saying is we have to really get it out there and let people know that this is what we're doing in a much more proactive and collective way.
That's what the Council of Americas is doing, because by doing this alone, you make it possible for people to hear four of us exchange some ideas.
I want to thank all four of you. This has been a terrific panel, and thank you all for what you're doing for the Americas. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Susan.
No, we should get to...
Congratulations. Thank you. Thank you. Folks, we're going to continue the program right away, so don't get up and go anywhere because we're starting right now. So please stay seated and we'll continue the program.